when you first began to hear about these artificial syrups. And every time the price of syrup went up a little bit, the percentage of syrup, they started out, some of them had, 50, 75% pure maple syrup still in them. They just diluted it a little bit. It just kept getting worse. They got clear down to 2-3%. And the packers, I remember going to maple schools for years in the 1950s, and the packers would be going, they'd have a man, they paid him to go to every single one of them to tell the maple producers how bad it was last year and why prices were only 20 cents a pound, and why make more syrup this coming year, because probably the price wouldn't be down more than 2 more cents. And when we got to 1959, a lot of people felt that by the year 2000, of course that was a long ways off, the industry would be extinct. And it actually didn't hit rock bottom until 1971. That was the worst total volume production year in the history of Vermont. And it was about that time we finally began to turn some things around, and the industry in Vermont made a big growth between 1970 and 1980. But the other states just kind of leveled off. They quit dropping, but they didn't really gain much of anything. In fact, during the 1960s, New York was the leading maple state for a number of reasons. Most of the time, I think probably 8 years out of 10, they outproduced Vermont for that. That's the only time in history they ever did. And we took care of that problem by the time we got to the early 1970s and whatever. But actually, there were a lot of great things happening in the 60s, and yet it didn't turn things around. I mean, in the 60s, syrup was retailing for about about $7 a gallon. That don't sound like much today. Maple plastic tubing first came out. 2 companies had it. Bob Land was one. He had one system, and 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, produced another tubing, and that was handled by Leader, which was then in Burlington that time before they merged with the Sol company up in St. Albans and whatever. And that system, of course, when they first started out with it, neither system worked very well, and a lot of producers tried it 2 or 3 years and literally quit, threw it in the ground or in the backyard, sugar house or somewhere, and went back to buckets again. So it got off to a slow start, but eventually it did do something. In the meantime, the Philly lab down there outside of Philadelphia, the USDA lab down there, Dr. Willits was working on a lot of things, and I remember we went down to there. He had a triennial conference for maple people to come down to see every 3 years. We went down there in the fall of 1965, where we viewed this massive machine on the back of a dump truck, $25,000 machine. Well, I can tell you, a sugar maker needed that thing with $7 syrup and oil at 11 cents a gallon. And it was a reverse osmosis machine. Something great to look at, but who needed it? Interestingly enough, in just 10 years, 1975, we had the big oil crunch, and oil suddenly went from 10 or 15 cents a gallon to $1.30 a gallon, and all of a sudden ROs became practical, and that's when the RO first started getting seriously used in the maple industry. That was one turnaround right there. Dr. Marvin had done a lot of, well, here again, Dr. Posh Robbins out at Michigan State invented the paraformaldehyde pellet, and that was supposed to keep your trees running. They did keep them running as long as they froze and thawed. Some of them even ran the next fall. They didn't heal up, and so everybody was using them gung-ho, which gave them a longer season, but about all it did was make more poor grade, usable syrup at the end of the season that didn't really do what it was supposed to do, and Vermont frowned on it, and Dr. Marvin did a lot of research on it, and the research, of course, back then, the public wasn't worried about it. They couldn't care less. I mean, formaldehyde was all right as far as they were concerned. You didn't have the kind of people you got now. And but they were concerned about the trees, because every once in a while you'd see a tree that didn't heal up, and there'd be a dead streak right from the roots right up at the crown of the tree. And so Dr. Marvin pushed that point, and of course everybody in the rest of Maple States, they thought they were the greatest things in the world. And of course they didn't like Vermont for what they were promoting and all that. They were outlawed in Vermont in 1981, and they didn't finally get outlawed in the U.S. until 1994 when the registration of them ran out, and they never went beyond that. But so, and then of course oil-fired evaporators came into being too, so you didn't have to hire that extra man to fire the evaporators, and oil was so cheap and everything. So that was another thing in the 60s. But in spite of all that, the prices were so bad that the industry was still, people were quitting, going out, and they'd say, well, I can't afford to make maple syrup. And the main reason it was, of course, they weren't getting enough for it. And the other thing too, we got to realize, starting out around 1950, your pickup field baler came out, your field forage harvester came out. The Industrial Revolution was taking over in agriculture, and agriculture was moving rapidly forward in the dairy industry, which is big in Vermont, and all these different things. And to a lot of people, that was moving automated much faster than maple was. So the heck with maple, we're gonna go other types of agriculture. So maple kept declining, and till I say, I think in 1971, Vermont only tapped 1,025,000 and a quarter trees, and in 1944 they tapped 5 million. So that's how much it had dropped off in that length of time. And but again, one of the things that every time there's been a crisis in maple, interestingly enough, it didn't put the industry out of business. The crisis created something better. The maple, every single decade that I can remember, from 1950 on, there was a maple crisis of some kind. And when it was resolved, the maple industry had something better. And you know, out of the oil crunch in the middle 70s, we wound up with the RO, and we wound up with much more efficient evaporators, much totally redesigned and all that, much better stuff. That by then, the research people had done a good job for 15 years to finally get maple tubing where it was working good. And I remember back in 1960, there was a Frenchman up in Westford, Vermont, and he got this idea of putting vacuum on tubing. Jim Marvin, he was really curious about that. And he went up there one day, and I remember Jim telling about it afterwards. You were kind of laughing about it. He said, I watched this guy sugar woods, and he said, the roots of the trees are going just like this with that vacuum on them. Of course, he was just kidding, you know. And here was the first pioneer in vacuum. And, you know, it was another 40 years before vacuum really got to be something. But he was the first guy that saw the advantage of it, and that was where it would come. Another great leader that we had in the middle 1970s was Tom Bear. He was county forester in Addison County, and people weren't getting the tubing strung up the way it should be. And Tom had quite a ritual. He says, tubing's got to be put up, it's got to be straight, it's got to be downhill, and only so many taps on the line and all that. And he preached that for I don't know how long, and long before anybody ever heard of Glenn Goodrich. Tom Bear was the guy that really turned the industry around and really got the tubing systems working. So that was another big plus right there. So that was a labor-saving fact. So Vermont was able to move forward on that, and by 1980, our production was probably 50% more in New York, maybe more than that. And we were once again the undisputed leader in maple production. And we made steady progress from then all the way to the year 2000. Not any big gains in any one year, but in fact, you get clear to about 2004, and from 2004 to the present time right now, the industry in Vermont has tripled. The industry in the rest of the U.S. has doubled. It's even making Canada nervous. And so it's the thing that concerns me right now is we've got people moving in here from out of state with money in their pockets and taking advantage of every freebie thing that they can pick up, and they're just mass producing maple syrup. And I hope we've got a gourmet product and we get a gourmet price for it, and I hope it just doesn't become a commodity product for a dime a dozen. We've got people in the state now that can produce anywhere from 200 to 400 gallons of syrup an hour. Can you imagine that? Incredible. And these people are only in it for money. I mean, they don't care what happens. I look at people anywhere up to 100,000 taps, like the Brannons up there, as being very family-oriented maple producers. But when we start hearing about these, there's supposed to be one going in here right in Mendon. I don't even know where the trees are. 150,000 taps in the next 2 or 3 years. There's a guy come down from Canada because he don't like the quotas in Canada, and he set up a 150,000 tap operation up in Island Pond, Vermont, Essex County, where they don't make much syrup normally, and so forth. And he's processing and sending it all over the country. And I mean, I hate to see it get out there. It's just a nickel and dime thing on a shelf. And the other thing too, you can push technology too far, and some of these people, I think, I say it myself. I think we got a new flavor out there now. I call it the technology flavor, and it's a little bit bland. It doesn't really have the in-depth maple flavor that a lot of people like, and I think it's because some of them are pushing ROs clear up to 22%. If you're sweetening sap up to 22%, you've taken about 90% of the water, and so you're not going to have much time to add much color and flavor to it, and what little boiling it's going to take to finish it. It's a great way to make money, because with the RO, all you got to do is pay for electricity to run a pump. You're not using any heat or energy that way. But I mean, what do you want to sell for a product? That's the question.